All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Connecticut Hemp webinar series number 3. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to give people just a little bit more time to come on here. So we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping and rules of the road and instructions for this webinar series. Please feel free to use the chat box to put down any comments or anything you'd like to share with the community on here. One of the things that we were hoping to do with this webinar series is to make this an opportunity for you to be able to meet people, do some networking, make some new contacts, share information. So please use the chat if there's something that you'd like to communicate out to the greater group. However, for questions to the speakers, if we could please ask that you would limit the questions just to the Q&A box. There's another separate box down there for Q&A. If you could put questions to the speakers in the Q&A, that'll help us organize our questions and be able to answer your questions a little bit easier. That would be a great help. Thank you. Very quickly, this meeting has been approved for the state of Connecticut pesticide certification credits. To explain that just a little bit more, I'd like to have Suresh Kimia from Yukon Extension, specializing in vegetables and hemp. Just explain that just a little bit more, please.
Thanks, Jim. As Jim mentioned, 1.5 pesticide recertification credits has been approved for today's webinar, and this would be good for all New England states. If you are seeking credits from this webinar, please type your name and email address in the chat box, and I will follow up with you for more information that I'll need in order to send you the certificate of the pesticide recertification credit. I'll put my email address in the chat box as well, just to make sure that the things get to me. So if you miss this in the chat box, you can email me later on, but I would ask you to send the information by the end of this week, because I need to submit the list in a week or so. So that's all I have.
Great, thank you very much, Suresh. All right, so this is webinar number 3 in a series of a 2-part series. Part 1, we're focusing a little bit more on growers topics, and we're also working in the background on part 2, which is going to focus a little bit more on processors topics. For more information on this, please visit the Connecticut RC&D website, Hemp, for a little bit more information, as well as recordings of the previous webinars. For your information, today's webinar is being recorded. All participants will be muted and cameras off so that we can focus on the presentations today. Again, please feel free to ask questions. We're looking for your questions, things that you're interested in, would like to know more about. Again, using the Q&A box. If you have things that you'd like to go out to the community as part of a networking or just general comments, please feel free to use the chat box. This webinar series is being made possible with the planning and partnership with the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, the Connecticut Hemp Industry Association, Yukon Extension, the USDA NRCS, and the Connecticut RC&D. If you haven't already, please register for any of the other upcoming webinars in the webinar series from the Connecticut RC&D website /hemp for more information. And with that, we are going to get started with today's presentations. If you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to work to put the presentation up on the screen here. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to do, that takes up all my screen. So I'm going to do quick introductions for Corby Brown. I'd like to introduce Corby Brown to you. He is a grower down in the wonderful state of Kentucky, runs a farm down there, and he's going to discuss his experience with hemp production from transplant to flowering in a no-till production system. In this, he's going to cover some of the soil management, pest management, and his experiences with the no-till implements and some of the modifications that he used on the equipment until he could find a system that worked for their farm. So with that, Corby Brown, may I please pass it over to you? And while you're introducing yourself, I'm going to put your presentation up on the screen.
Thank you very much, Jim. As he said, I'm Corby Brown. I live in South Central Kentucky. We run a grain, tobacco / hemp operation, as well as sell transplanters for the transplanting of tobacco, hemp, and a lot of other things. We'll start with a slide first here of a hemp field that was actually in 2019 at my own farm. You'll see in the picture from the left is a nephew, Elliot Brown, a brother, Larry Brown, a son, Christopher, and another gentleman, Clint Palmer, who is a consultant working with us in the hemp process. And this is no-till. And move into the next slide. You see a picture of a cover crop that.
And I'm sorry, Corby,
Okay.
I went one slide too far.
A good deal. Okay, so you see a slide there of a no-till transplanter that was set up for tobacco, but does a good job for hemp. In that slide picture is the gentleman in the blue shirt has worked with me for years. Ron. The next one over is Eric Copus, who actually works with the NRCS in Macon County, Tennessee. And then I'm the next one over, and then the lady is Carrie, who works with Eric. Below that, you'll see a internet opportunity to look at something that you might see interesting. Over the years, we've been involved in moving from conventional to eventually the no-till. So we have done that. And also starting in actually the early 90s for sure, we transitioned to the entire no-till row crop system and just do not have a need to conventional till any of the fields moving forward. Moving on to the next slide, and starting with the no-till part of hemp. It obviously starts with a good field, preferably with a cover crop. This particular cover crop here is ryegrass. You can use wheat, crimson clover. A lot of things can be added to establish a good cover crop. The cover crops obviously have a lot of benefits, from nutrition to soil health to soil tilth. They really help with the soil. Another thing you want to look at is field history. If you can at all, you preferably want to know the cropping history on those fields moving toward hemp. You want to know about the fertilization if you can. Obviously, you will want to get a soil test to determine what your needs are. And also, it's nice to know the herbicides, pesticides, fungicides that's been on that field in the past. And moving on to the next slide. Once you get that determined, you want to start preparing for your seedlings. You may take up to 10 weeks for your seedlings to be ready for the field. I think some people maybe get that done in fewer weeks than that, but you would want to work with your seed people, and if you were not doing the seeding of the trays, you would want to check with them on timing and all of that. You would want to terminate your cover crop at least 30 days prior to the planting of your no-till crop. And that can be done by a variety of methods. You can terminate it by use of a Roundup or chemical, if that's allowed in your state. You can terminate it by a roller with a series of blades on it that will roll it down. And in our case, in 2019, due to the weather conditions, we had to cut the cover crop and bale it and remove it from the field. We had some excessive moisture that prevented us from moving onto the field without removing it. We waited a few days after we did that, we caught some dry weather and was able to transplant the no-till hemp. Shortly thereafter, it did start raining, created some issues with weed control, but ideally you'll find a dry period there to get it planted. And if you can get that done with a good cover crop, again, you get greater organic matter and lots of other soil health benefits from that. Moving on to the next slide. If your soil is too moist, too wet, you can create muddy conditions. As you'll see in the picture, that's a one-row no-till transplanter. It's set up with the modifications that we've learned over the years was necessary to plant no-till. You really need the top 4 or so inches reasonably dry to prevent the mud from sticking to your equipment. Moving on to the next slide. This is a small video clip, if we can get it started, that is of a no-till transplanter planting into ryegrass that was terminated by chemical means some 30 days prior to planting. And moving on to the next slide if the video is stopped. Another video of a more mature wheat crop that was a few years prior. It's actually in tobacco. Shows the Martin row cleaners that we introduced into the no-till system. Shows the wavy coulters and the shanks, and does a pretty good job in a variety of conditions. That wheat crop was a little over mature, but we were able to make that work for us in the tobacco crop. Moving on to the next. So when you working with hemp, you're a lot of chemicals, a lot of things out there that's unapproved. So you have to start coming up with other means to take care of weeds, insects, disease, and so forth. As I mentioned earlier, there was a gentleman in the picture, Clint Palmer, that came out about every 2 weeks, worked with us, scouted the fields to help us determine our issues. One of the things we did deal with that year due to the excessive rains, we had some pigweed, ragweed, and some ryegrass that when we terminated it by cutting it, it actually suckered back out or sprouted. So we had to deal with that. And at that time, the best method was garden hose and just go in and take care of it until it covered till the hemp plant covered to help smother out the unwanted weeds. As far as insects, we scouted the field and we watched for some of the bigger issues was budworms, aphids, and a hemp borer, I believe is its name. It actually bore into the stalk and actually kill the plant. So we relied heavily on scouting. And moving on to the next slide. As I said earlier, you need to know your soils, you need to know your fields. And one of the best methods of that is to get soil test and develop a good plan for fertilization. And in our case, we created our plan based on our soil test, and we utilized 225 units of nitrogen, 50 units of phosphorus, 150 units of sulfate of potash. And that is similar to tobacco needs. Tobacco requires a lot, so it kind of went hand in hand with tobacco. As far as spacing of the plants for hemp in the fields, we tried about 3 different test plots, I guess you would say. We started with 40-inch row spacings because our tobacco was on 40. That seemed to be a good place to start. So we went 40 and then 27-inch plant to plant. That was a little bit tight. The plants didn't hardly have enough space to grow. But again, you would want to go back to your varieties of seed that you were using to determine what your plant spacings might need to be. We did go to a 40 by 54-inch plant to plant. We thought that was a good spacing for the variety that we had. We did try 80-inch. We skipped every other row, and then 54 inches plant to plant. That was a little wide. It created more weed pressure, and we had to deal with that in that situation. Moving on to the next slide. Back on the transplanter a little bit. The C&M transplanter that's built by an Italian company, Keki and Magali. They developed 5 shoes that's easily changed on the machines. And the machine that we use is the Trime unit. And what we found generally for hemp, the middle shoe in that picture is generally been accepted wider than most of the others. Few people stayed with the size that's one size bigger. We call it the number 4 shoe. But you have to match that shoe with your root ball. If you don't, you'll have trouble with it staying in the shoe. You want that root ball to wedge into that shoe so that it doesn't turn over before the transplanter kicks it out into the soil. And moving on to the next slide. Another thing you need to be aware of is adapting your tractor to the planter you're using. And I'm going to use a 2-row planter for just discussion purposes. You would, for a 2-row no-till planter with a water barrel on the toolbar, you would need at a minimum, a 55 horsepower tractor with counterweights on the front. More than likely, a loader would work to counterbalance. You'd need adequate hydraulics pressure to lift that planter. And that would be the minimum. You might even want to consider more in the 75 horsepower size of tractor. The example I used was a 50-55E John Deere. Any similar spec tractor would work. Without a loader, you would probably want 300 to 400 pounds of weight on the front. If you were going bigger acres, you might want to consider putting a water barrel on the front of your tractor. And moving on to the next slide. This is a picture of the 2-row no-till transplanter, 3-point hitch, that can be easily adapted to this trailer. This trailer has extra tray racks. It holds 280 gallons of water and will support the no-till transplanter with ease. And again, you'd need about a 55 horsepower tractor to make that work in the field easily. And moving on to the next slide. Back to the transplanters. Some years ago, 6 or 8 now, I guess it's been, when we started this transition, C&M transplanter people out of Italy, they developed a no-till attachment that went directly in front of their units that they already had built. So it was an add-on that could be easily added on. So the initial shank they built was an inverted shank, I call it. Did not have a shear bolt, required a lot of weight on the toolbar or down pressure from the tractor. And that's not, you won't see many tractors with down pressure. So that was an issue that we ran into. So moving on to the next slide. I developed a shank that had a shear bolt in it. We actually added wings to it and then a point. I developed that so that it would go into the ground without any kind of down pressure. And in doing that, it worked well for what we were doing. And if you shear a bolt, you simply stop and have to replace it. A little bit of time, but it saves your equipment and makes for a really nice shank for no-till. And moving on to the next picture. After I developed the black shank earlier there, C&M came back and developed a similar shank that is pictured there that seems to work well also. And moving on to the next slide. Another addition to the no-till attachment that wasn't on originally was the addition of the Martin row cleaner. In the first year that we started no-tilling, we found a need for something like that. So I went to the Martin row cleaner people and we were fortunate to find one that would be easily attached to this C&M no-till attachment. So we attached that, and after a couple of years, C&M made that part of their no-till kit as well. And moving on to the next picture. As I said, the original no-till machine had the reverse shanks, had a small wing on it. We moved forward with the additions that I've spoke about and developed what is now the current version that C&M offers, which is pictured. I do still have available the black shank for people that would want to use it, but coming from CNM, that's what you would get, what is pictured there. Moving on to the next picture. This is another video of actually a 3-row hemp transplanter on a trailer. It's actually out in Nevada, and it is planting hemp in a cover crop and doing a nice job. It, as you can see, looking at the background of the picture, it is out in a large field in Nevada with the mountains in the background. And moving on to the next slide. That pretty much covers what I had to cover. I guess I could leave it open now for questions, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Hyde. And
All right, thank you very much, Corby. In order to be able to see what's going on here, I need to stop sharing the screen and get back into, oh goodness, get back into my Zoom here. So just very quickly, let me take a look at the Q&A for any questions. I don't see any questions in there. Please throw them in there if you've got any questions for Corby related to his experience with no-till transplanting. It is something that we would love to learn from your experience, Corby, for a lot of the benefits that you had mentioned earlier. I think one of the interesting parts is one of the beneficial parts for sure is the weed control. That one certainly catches a lot of attention. Then some of the other benefits about the increased root structure, soil structure from the roots, the organic matter, soil moisture preservation, all those things are certainly very attractive. So thank you very much for your time on that. We're gonna solicit more questions. So please don't hesitate to bring those questions out there. Throw them in the Q&A. While that's going on, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Heather Darby. Heather Darby comes to us from the University of Vermont, UVM. She wears so many hats, it's hard to catch her with just one on. Today, she's going to be presenting on soil management for high quality hemp, managing soils to produce high yield and quality hemp. Heather is an extension agronomist with the University of Vermont and has been conducting applied research in industrial hemp since 2015, delivering research-based outreach information to farmers throughout the Northeast. With that, Heather, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if everybody received my panicked emails that our internet went out. I hope you didn't, but it's back on. It's back on miraculously. So
we're glad to have you.
Yeah, I mean, within like minutes. So Corby, you almost had to keep talking for a while longer. So thanks everyone. It's really great. I'm actually gonna shut my camera off so to preserve internet. It's great to, I guess, not see everyone quite, but to welcome everyone to the hemp webinar. And as Jim was mentioning, I'm gonna talk about soil management mostly, if I can get my slide to go down. Seems to not want to do that. Let me see here. There we go. All right, so just quickly, hemp itself is, the great thing about hemp, I guess, is that it is adaptable to many regions throughout the world. So that's great. It's pretty cold tolerant, which is good for us here in New England, but it also does have a level of tolerance for hot and arid conditions. So it doesn't mind being grown down in Kentucky, and it doesn't mind being grown up in Connecticut and Vermont either. I think the great thing about that is that this means a lot of farmers have an opportunity to grow hemp, but the bad piece of that is that a lot of farmers have the opportunity to grow hemp. So that means we need more markets, and there's is and will probably continue to be a lot of hemp on the marketplace because of that. So one piece to note, and I think Corby said this as well, is that hemp definitely does not tolerate waterlogged soils. So if you have those really heavy clay soils that do not drain very well and tend to hold on to water, your hemp is, going to have a tough time. So make sure wherever you're investing your hemp acreage in, that you have some good, well-structured and well-drained soils. And then, of course, hemp does thrive the most under um, full sun conditions. So hemp prefers temperatures between 60 and 80 degrees. So it doesn't like it really too hot, although it can deal with it, and it doesn't like it too cold either. So it's kind of in that range that we see a lot for soybeans, really, actually, and some corn crops too. It can withstand frost on the little seedlings and on the big plants, something that we experienced this year for sure. We got a frost up here in early September. And although it did sort of kill back some of the leaves on the plants, it didn't kill the plants completely. It is, depending on what you're growing hemp for, it can be a pretty short season crop and it can be a full season crop as well. So if you're growing hemp for fiber, it really is it's about a 2.5 month crop. So you plant the hemp in June, first week of June, and then you're mowing it down for fiber really right at the point where you see flower formation, you're mowing it down. So for us, that's in August. And if you're growing for grain, then you're generally looking at about a 4-month crop. So you're harvesting around Labor Day. And if you're harvesting flour or biomass for crops that are destined for the kind of essential oil or CBD market, you're definitely looking at a very full season crop. For us, many of the varieties that we've been growing are not harvested until October. So we are looking at a full season crop. And I think everybody knows kind of the longer season we need to grow a crop. Sometimes more risk the crop is in, and also the more needs it has, since it's kind of spreading its growing time out across the entire season. So we hear a lot about the roots of hemp, and they can dig deep into the soil, and that really is true. It's definitely more true for direct seeded crops, and also for seedlings. I think a little bit less true for plants that are developed as clones, but hemp can have a really long taproot or deep taproot if there's friable soil. So again, this goes back to having those deep soils that are well structured. You definitely can get roots, 6-7 feet deep, which is great. This is how this plant can withstand drought conditions and those arable conditions, because it's able to dig really deep down into the ground and get moisture and nutrients. But again, you need good conditioned soil to be able to do that. And as, of course, the texture of your soil changes, the condition of your soil changes, the depth of those roots starts to sort of shrink up. So just keep that in mind. If you want that highly vigorous, productive plant, you need to have really good deep soils that have good structure and are well drained. Again, I mentioned temperature, and we have looked at this a bit at UVM because obviously it gets cold in Vermont. And as I had mentioned, the plant really does seem to tolerate these kind of cooler conditions. So this blue line here shows hemp that was outside, experiencing multiple times temperatures below freezing over the course of about 7 days. Was hit with a kind of a light frost a few times. It didn't really bother the plant all that much. It certainly began to degrade relatively quickly once it did get frosted, but it didn't seem to impact the overall cannabinoid content of those plants. Now, I don't know what it did to essential oils, but again, just sort of making the case that this is definitely a good plant for our region as long as it's growing on those better textured soils. As far as water requirements, Like many of our crops in the Northeast, hemp requires a good amount of rainfall to be the most productive. So we're looking at about 20 to 30 inches of rainfall, which generally isn't an issue here or in Kentucky. We usually get plenty of rain. Last year was definitely a dry year for many of us. But I think what we have to remember is that, like most crops, hemp requires most of its moisture during that vegetative stage into early flowering. So basically, the first kind of 6 to 8 weeks of the plant's life is when it really needs quite a bit of the water, about half. And then over the rest of the lifespan of the plant, it needs a little less water. So this is really important to keep in mind, because people ask me, do I need irrigation or not to grow hemp? And really, the take home message on that is, well, you know, if you give a plant what it needs when it needs it most, you're definitely going to help to maximize yield, right? So if it needs the most water during the vegetative stage and we're going through a drought, you're likely going to see reduced yield versus if you had been able to give it water when it needed it most. However, in most years in the Northeast and New England, you're still going to be able to produce a decent yielding crop without irrigation. Okay, so irrigation can be supplemental. Obviously, there's an added cost to it. So, but it can pay off. And here's just some data from our trial simply showing that in a relatively normal year, applying irrigation did increase the yields, but we still got decent yields with regular sort of rain-fed grown hemp as well. And this is pounds of dry matter per plant. So you can see we were just over, or just under 1.5, just over 1, with just rain-fed crop, and just over 2 when we irrigated. One of the things I want to point out, and I'm not entirely sure how much this is impacting the hemp grown in our region, but we do know that as water stress in oil type plants, essential oil type plants, occurs, especially during that sort of flower time where we see essential oils accumulating. So these are the cannabinoids, CBD and THC. We do know that those levels will be driven up. So managed water stress, indoor production, there is a lot of evidence for that to be able to increase concentrations of CBD, and for those growing THC heavy plants to increase THC as well. And it has been shown, again, undercover, when you initiate that stress during flowering, that you can increase those levels quite considerably. So I'm mostly saying this throwing caution to the wind, because we oftentimes are trying to manage the THC levels to be in compliance so that we have a compliant crop. And so withholding water late in the season because you may be thinking, hey, crop's just about done, I'm done watering, may not be the smartest idea, especially if you're using black plastic mulch and there's no other way to get rainfall to the plants. So just, again, a little bit of caution. I don't have any exact in-field science about this, but just simply showing that if we are drought stressing these plants, especially as we're moving into that cannabinoid building phase of flowering, we may be also inching up the THC at the same time. So soil, again, I already mentioned, let's grow that hemp on our best soils if we have them on our farm. And this sort of perception that hemp grows any and everywhere isn't necessarily true, and definitely isn't true when you're trying to maximize productivity. However you look at that, may not always be yields, may be quality, but growing on those loose, well-drained loams is kind of the ultimate. But wherever you're growing, again, you really want to make sure you have really good soil physical properties and soil health, because you want to get that deep root system and have healthy plants overall. We have noticed, in fields where there's 40% or more clay content, the hemp plants tend to suffer a bit. So you may want to steer clear of those if you can. And we're looking for soils, of course, that have adequate pH over 6. This crop does require a lot of bases to grow, so like calcium as an example. And so we want to make sure the pH of the soil is over 6. And of course, in our regions here in New England, we do have a lot of soils that tend to dip down below 6. And I'm just saying, if you want to have a good crop, let's get those soil pHs up. High organic matter soils are also important because of the physical properties we need to have a good crop. So just thinking about that. Now, I know most people probably on the call are most interested in growing for like the CBD or CBG market, and you're not necessarily planting from seed, but there certainly is a strong movement towards growing more grain and more fiber, and also growing biomass for CBD production, where we're actually planting from seed now. With much closer spacing and not planting from transplants. And really, again, the take home message here is that especially the baby hemp, the seeds, the ugly teenagers, they're all really susceptible to poor soil conditions. And if you are planting from seed, I'm sure you can notice here that the soil doesn't look the best. You can see it's kind of crusted on the top. There's big gaps between the plants coming up. You have uneven emergence. This is bad, as I'm sure you notice, but hemp is really susceptible to poor germination and emergence in soils that have poor conditions. So this is really critical to having high yielding hemp, especially for fiber or grain, or if you are growing for biomass, because where all these empty holes are here, we know what's going to grow there if there's no hemp. It's weeds. And if we're trying to promote a crop that is, weed suppressive, we hear a lot about this, doesn't require a lot of pesticides, so on and so forth, we have to have those really good stands to be able to grow a crop like that. All right, so again, the seedling stage is very sensitive here, and this is just some data we have showing, and this is day neutral hemp, so autoflower hemp that we planted up at the research farm, planted on June 17th from seed. A lot of autoflowers are planted from seed. And we only had 47% germ, which is really bad, especially when you're paying $1 a seed, that's a huge loss. And, the reason for that, again, is exactly what I just showed you. We didn't really have the best soil conditions. Then I think we got about a 2 or 3 inch rainstorm, a huge deluge. And, just ended up that those little seedlings couldn't get out of the ground. And we ended up with a really poor stand. We replanted a week or so later and ended up with a much better stand. But again, especially planting from seed, you need to be cautious of this. So again, transplanting helps to overcome that. But definitely when these plants are young, they are pretty weak, and giving them the best environment to grow in will help them build into those really vigorous plants that we all hear about and know, and then love, of course. So we already heard about go out and get your soil tests. This is really critical. One of the things that I often see are people hearing, oh, well, I heard you need a couple 100 pounds of nitrogen to grow hemp, and a couple 150 pounds of potassium. That's what this farmer did that I heard gave this talk, so that's what I'm going to do. And those what individual farmers are doing, I'm sure, based on soil tests, but your soil could be really different. And you don't want to over apply nutrients for so many reasons. When you're over applying nutrients in hemp, A, you're wasting money. B, you could be causing environmental issues. C, you could be causing more pest problems, diseases, and insect pests, as an example. They love those over-fertilized plants or under-fertilized plants. And then on top of that, when you're adding too many nutrients at certain times of hemp growth, you could be extending or not extending the vegetative period, but the maturation period. You could be impacting the CBD development and so on and so forth. So really take a soil test. It's super cheap, it's easy to do, and it's great information to base actual fertility management on. Here's just an example. This is from UVM. UConn has soil tests too. I think we all use the same analysis tools in our states here in New England, but it gives you a really good indication of what the nutrient levels are in your soil. And you can see here, this soil has low phosphorus, low potassium. The pH is pretty good at 6.4. Kind of looking at everything else here, I feel like I'm in pretty good shape. The organic matter's 5.3. So it definitely looks like I need some fertility because it is low. So, let's think about what we should be adding and then when. So most soil test labs now will give hemp recommendations. I don't know if UConn does. Maybe Jim can address that afterwards. But UVM does. I know Dairy One, Agri One does. I believe Maine does as well. So you should get a recommendation on the bottom. This one happens to be for pasture, but nonetheless, it'll, recommend how much nitrogen you should put on, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium. These are in actual like pounds of nutrient per acre. So you need to convert this to pounds of fertilizer, whatever it is you're using, whether that's manure or some kind of organic amendment, or maybe it's commercial fertilizers like muriate of potash or urea. But nonetheless, here's what you need to put on the ground, and then you can decide what fertilizers you're going to apply to meet those needs. But you have the information to go by. And then, of course, the pH, like I said, you really need to keep the pH above 6. Ideally, with hemp, you really should be in that sort of 6.5. So slightly acidic, something under 7 is slightly acidic. And so really 6.5 is a good target for you. And the obvious reason for that, by looking at this graph, is that that's when the nutrients that your crop needs from your soil are most available. And if your pH is too low or too high, nutrients become less available, or in the case of those micronutrients, when we don't need very much of them, they may become too available and end up harming your crop. So again, keeping those pHs above 6, 6.5 is good, is important. So what about hemp specifically? I'm working on fertility management in hemp. It takes time to do this work, and we haven't been able to do it for the last, 100 or so years. So we certainly don't have the information we have for other crops, like corn or soybeans or vegetables. But we do know that hemp itself, if I take the whole plant and I grind it up, 3 to 4% of it is nitrogen, and 2 to 3% of it is potassium, and only 0.5% to 0.6% of it is phosphorus. So you can see that the plant itself takes more nitrogen than potassium or phosphorus. And as far as macronutrients go, it requires phosphorus in the least amount of quantities. So again, depending on your soil test, you'll need varying levels of these nutrients. Okay. So, on average, we see recommendations for phosphorus, about 40 to 50 pounds, and potassium, again, really dependent on your soil test, anywhere from 60, 70 pounds. And of course, it can be upwards of 100 pounds, hundreds of pounds, depending on the physical or the nutrient state of your soil. So this is why you need to get that soil test. So the nitrogen itself, really we need to apply it early on, right? So the nitrogen needs to go on during the vegetative stage. It does require, quite a bit of nitrogen, very similar actually to a corn crop. We're talking in most cases, about 100 pounds or so, maybe a little more. But again, that total amount of nitrogen that you need will be based on the organic matter in your soil currently. So if you're on a dairy farm and you're growing hemp and you've been adding manure to those fields for every year for the last, since your grandfather was there, grandmother, the amount of nitrogen you need could be pretty minimal. But in general, if you don't have a history of organic matter amendments, on a yearly basis, you may need to be adding anywhere from 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen. So here's some data from our trials showing just that. So this work was done on fields where we hadn't added manure for many years or any kind of organic amendment. And you can see the percent nitrogen in the crop maxed out at 125 pounds of nitrogen. So this basically says, this crop didn't really need any more once we had added 125 pounds. We had reached sort of 3.25% in that crop. So, I feel like our guidelines are pretty decent right now with nitrogen again, but whatever you put on that soil, you need to think about what has been added before, so that you're not over applying. So again, here's our flower yield with different rates of nitrogen. And you can see, this was really interesting to me, that we didn't see a huge difference in yield. So the leaves, the stems, but the flower yield wasn't actually increasing statistically with additional pounds of nitrogen. So, this says to me, okay, we need to do some more work here, because I'm not sure if we need to be growing, plants that are necessarily leafier. What we're trying to do is maximize flower yield. Okay. So again, we still have work to do, but we still know that hemp needs a good amount of nitrogen to grow. And for us here in the East, we're going to be up in that 100 probably pound rate. So, too much nitrogen, we hear and have seen in the literature that it can stimulate the formation of male flowers. If you put too much on at one time, it can cause kind of lodging. We see this in other crops too. So what we want to make sure that we're doing is adding split applications of nitrogen throughout the vegetative period, or at least breaking it up, so that we're not putting a huge slug of nitrogen on at one time. And of course, there's lots of reasons to do that environmentally, but also, we want to make sure that we're not kind of stressing the plant out. And sometimes if you put too much fertility on early on and we get a lot of rain, you're going to lose it. And then your plant still might be nitrogen deficient anyway. So again, like other crops, split applications are going to be the best with nitrogen. So we do hear a lot about, if you add too much nitrogen, you're going to, see spikes with THC, or if you don't add enough nitrogen, you're going to see THC spikes. We have not observed that. I mean, we haven't pushed the rates really, really high. And we also fed these plants over time. We didn't put on slugs of nitrogen at one time. We didn't put on 150 pounds all at one time and cause some stress in the plant. So overall, we didn't see that. I'm wondering though if we did see sort of a depression in CBD with really high rates. So it looks like the CBD concentrations peaked at 100 pounds and then went down on either end of that. And other people have noticed that too. So here's THC concentrations in leaves, just showing that, there is sort of a maximum, kind of an optimum amount, and then over applying nitrogen reduces THC in this case, but other cannabinoids as well. So again, just making the case to not put on too much, put this on in split applications, and make sure it's going on during the vegetative period. What about phosphorus fertility? You know, on many of our farms, I don't know about tobacco, but you know, many of our other systems, we put on a lot of fertility for various reasons. We may have dairy farms that have historical fertility applications, and we have soils that are really built up, let's say, especially in a nutrient like phosphorus. So we need to be really cautious about this. We don't really want to be adding more phosphorus if the soil test set already says it's high, or excessive or optimum. But what we do want to make sure is that there is plenty of available phosphorus, and a soil test will tell you that. We do know that hemp uses more phosphorus at flowering time than during the vegetative phase. So again, if you are going to apply phosphorus, it actually is okay to put it on early in the season because it doesn't usually leach, or it usually doesn't leach, and you know, should be there for the plant at flowering. But again, the important point here is that you have optimum phosphorus availability in your soil. Now with potassium, potassium really goes on right at the beginning of the season. We do know that way too much potassium around flowering time could delay the maturity, could reduce essential oil production. So we don't want to go out there if the soil test said you needed potassium. It's really something you want to put on at the beginning of the season. And you know, with potassium, it does leach. So again, you know, a split application might be necessary depending on how much you need. Micronutrients, we hear a lot about this. You know, again, soils in the Northeast tend to be, you know, we don't see a lot of micronutrient deficiencies up here in Vermont. We can on really light textured soils, so those very sandy soils that do not have a history of organic matter amendment. So we do have soils that leach here, but we have definitely had a history of high organic matter amendments. Organic matter, compost, manures, all those things, they have micronutrients in them. So generally it's not a huge issue for us here, but just, you know, just to be cautious, hemp does require a lot of magnesium. So remember I said those bases, magnesium is a base, calcium is a base, potassium, they are the nutrients, you know, that also drive the pH. So if you have a low pH, you really need to be, again, adding the bases so that you can bring that up. If your soil test says you need magnesium, you need to put it on because hemp does require, it has a high requirement for magnesium. Usually, you know, this is about 50 pounds or so. It's not a huge amount, but something to be paying attention to. And then, of course, for us, boron is often deficient in our soil, so we want to make sure to address that too. I'll end on crop rotation. We need to be rotating hemp. This is not a crop that can be or should be grown continuously. If you want to challenge me on that, go ahead. We can talk in a year or two. But hemp is susceptible to many diseases and really ideally should be rotated every couple of years. So, you know, growing hemp 2 years in a field is going to be okay. If you start going over that, you're really going to start seeing some disease issues, I'm sure. You want to make sure that you have enough time for those disease issues to dissipate. They do build up quickly, many of these. We have septoria leaf spot on the top here. I'm starting to see that in a lot of fields. And then below that, we have white mold. You know, you start building up levels of white mold in your field, and that's going to be a problem. It takes a long time to get rid of it. You know, years, not 2 years, but like years. So just be cautious, be building good rotations. We do know that hemp as part of a rotation can be really beneficial, but that's part of a rotation, not a single crop in a rotation. So please, I'm pleading with folks to be paying attention to this as they continue their quest growing hemp. And I think, Jim, I'll end right there so we have time for some questions.
Fantastic. We'll pick it up from there. Heather, thank you so much. Really enjoyed that. Love getting all the information that you have out there. Basic ag research. Can't get enough of it. So thank you. All right, I'm taking a look at that chat box. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A. Corby, we do have a question for you, if you wouldn't mind unmuting. There's a question here about wondering if you could describe some of the costs associated with some of the equipment that you use.
So two-row transplanter with water barrel, no-till, as the picture showed there, you're looking in the $28,000 to $30,000 range. Would be a close estimate. That could be a little bit on the higher side, but I don't want to tell somebody something, then it be more. So that's what you're looking at there as far as the no-till two-row transplanter. A no-till one-row transplanter, probably in the $16,000, possibly $17,000.
Excellent. Thank you. Right.
Jim, I did put my the website, our UVM extension website, in the chat box if anybody wants to check out any more of the work that we've done. It's all up there. So
fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I would second that notion. I keep an eye on that Northwest Crops webpage. There's always a lot of great information on going up on there. Heather has a crew of people with lots of different information on there, so it's a great place to keep an eye on. Again, thank you, Heather, for all that work that goes into that. We've got a comment from Suresh, just confirming that the Yukon Soil Test Lab does indeed provide recommendations for hemp. So a great encouragement there to follow Corby and Heather's recommendations to get that soil test in there. I also am a very big advocate of testing on a number of different things. Working with soils and nutrient management, can't advocate enough. My analogy is a map. If you were to look at a map, in order to know where you need to go, you need to know where you're starting from. If you don't know where you're starting from, you don't know which direction to go. So having a soil test is a great idea to figure out which direction you need to go. Increase your soil nutrients, decrease soil nutrients, stay the same. So soil testing is a great place to start. Now that it's springtime, some of the weather's starting to break. As soon as we get more of those nice sunny days out there, the soil is dry enough to walk out on there, grab that spade or that soil tester and do some damage with that soil. Get the soil tests in there. I was talking with the Yukon Soil Test Lab, Dawn Pindell, just the other, Dawn, and she mentioned that soil tests are coming in fast and furious, which I love to hear. But all the more reason to get that soil testing in and get it submitted. All right, I am looking for those questions. Please don't hesitate to send any questions in that you have. Again, I really wanted to thank Corby Brown for your time. He has given a lot of time and effort into this presentation today. Again, we brought him up from Kentucky via this platform here. One of the good things coming out of all these changes over the last year is it does make travel very easy. So Corby, thank you for taking the time to do this. And Heather, for you as well. I know people are always coming at you for more information and things to do. So this has been fantastic.
Corby, I had a question for you about the no-till. I mean, were there any, did you see any increases, do you think, in pests or, plant vigor, anything along those lines? Or you felt like it was like the same?
We obviously first year, a lot of factors play into those things, weather and all that. But Justin and the consultant that worked with us, he really liked what he's seen with our crop that year. Given the weather conditions, he liked it. We didn't overall find a huge amount of pest or disease or anything that was just causing us problems. So as far as any kind of hard data, don't have that, but we were very happy with it when we harvested it. As far as what we deemed to be a decent yield, we thought we had a good yield given everything.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah, that's exciting. I know we're gonna try this year. I wish I had that planner. I'm gonna try to get one of those, but all I have is my hands. No fun. But we're gonna try one like a rolled down cover crop this year because we have a bunch of winter rye planted. So we're gonna see about. I see it looked like oats. Was that like oats and tillage radishes or something that you had out there for a cover crop or?
The one out in Nevada, I'm not sure what it was.
Uh-huh.
The other two video clips, the latter one that was more mature was actually wheat.
Okay.
And the earlier one was ryegrass that looked like we had rolled it down, but we had not. It had just been from spraying and
Cool.
so forth. And that was in tobacco, so we was on the field several times.
Well, it'll be exciting. We'll see how we do.
We'll be happy to work with you all. Obviously, as I somewhat mentioned, I was engaged in the development of that a lot, and we moved to the end result, which was one of the last pictures. And be happy to work with anybody. And the numbers I was quoting earlier, anybody that's interested, please reach out to me. I'm always looking for putting another machine out there, and I'll try my best to work with anybody on the numbers to make something work. And if some of the universities would want to do something, we'll certainly love to work with them and get one up there that could be used on various farms.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll be reaching out. I think somebody else wants to know too. I think I have your email, but I don't know about others.
So I'll offer, Corby, if you would like to, we had put your telephone number and your email on your presentation. So when the recording comes out, people will be able to go scroll back and see that. Just for the time being, I can offer to put your telephone number and email in the chat if you'd like.
That would be fine. I'm open to that, and anybody with specific questions later, email, text, or call. I'm get several calls each day, so if I miss the call, don't hesitate to keep calling.
Could you mention your email just real quick?
The email address?
Yes.
Okay, it's Corby Brown 1975 @yahoo.com.
Excellent. And best phone number to reach you?
270-646-7431.
7431.
And that is a cell phone number, so you can text it as well.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. There was another, just for the general share. There was a question in that came in asking, are there any hemp business plans available to share? I'm going to have to admit, I personally do not have any information related to that, so I'm going to send that out to the community. If you'd like to get in touch, I'm sorry, Peter Van Geldern, I apologize. The email contact information is on the chat, if you'd like to get that from the chat box. All right, with that, I do want to be respectful of your time, so we'll start to wind this down here. Everyone will receive an email asking for your comments, a brief survey about today's webinar presentation. Please do take a moment just to fill that out. The organizers, this working committee is very interested in your comments of what we can do to make this better. The information presented, what type of information you would like to hear for future events, please let us know. That'll be coming in an email very shortly. I would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar series. I'd like to give a special shout out, if I may, to John Anderson, another Kentucky grower, and works with the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. He and Randy Smallwood from the Kentucky NRCS helped pull some of this information together, got us in touch with Corby Brown, and have provided some information on the no-till production. Also would like to thank our planners again. And I'd also like to thank the planning committee, Amanda Fargo Johnson with RC&D, Suresh Gimier, and Matt Tabaka from Yukon Extension, Becky Ghosh from Running Brook Farm, John Ireland, processor here in Connecticut, Kate Nelson from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture. Myself, my name is Jim Hyde with the USDA NRCS. And a special thank you to Jeff Wenzel from the Connecticut Hemp Industry Association for hosting this, seminar webinar series. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for review on the Connecticut RC&D website on the Hemp page. I invite you to check that out, as well as checking out for the upcoming webinar series. The next one will be on April 7th, featuring Alyssa Collins from Penn State, professor down there studying hemp, and she will present on hemp diseases. So it should be a great webinar series. If she has some information and webinars online, would encourage you to check that out. And she's going to be talking to us again on April 7th. So with that, I will thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next seminar.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jeff.